It is a book with a message, but more importantly, it is a story. We can write from things that we haven't personally experienced. I find that it's interesting to hear the different ways that a story can be perceived. So in writing a historical fiction, I think the research is absolutely important.
Hello, I'm Andrew Knowles from regencyhistory.net, and today I'm interviewing Elaine Kelly. And Elaine has written a book which is a bit different from the sort of books that we normally talk about in these interviews. We're normally talking about fiction and non-fiction around the Regency period, the late 18th century, the early 19th century. Elaine's book is, well, Elaine, tell us a little bit more about what it is that you've written.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for having me on your show. This is the picture of the book. Here we go. Forgotten Followers. Oh, I don't think you can see it very well, but it's called Forgotten Followers from Broken to Bold. Basically, it is set in the first century, but you and I, when we talked about coming on to the show, we talked about the commonalities between women in the atmosphere or culture or norms of the first century, and how I was surprised when I started researching it to find that women had actually some freedoms that we thought they were all completely restricted. And similarly, in the Regency's era, the impression is that women are completely restricted to home, but in the same way, women have some freedoms. And so I explored some of those freedoms and in the novel, which is meant to really empower women as equals.
Excellent, excellent. So it's set in the first century, so that's like 2,000 years ago.
It's set in the time of Jesus, during the time period of the four Gospels.
So what got you interested in writing this particular story?
Well, my background is as a financial advisor, so I worked for 30 years in financial investments and insurance sales and advice. But when I sort of was closing in on retirement, I started looking at women in the church and realizing that the freedoms for women had actually moved backwards instead of frontwards during the time when I was looking the other way at the financial world. And I didn't think that was biblical or consistent with the Christianity that I grew up with, which had women in leadership roles all along. And so I was surprised at that. But not only that, I wanted to show or demonstrate in a story, which I think is an effective way of demonstration, to show that Jesus didn't treat women with limitations. Jesus lifted women up, empowered them as disciples, equipped them to go out as evangelists and as apostles. So in the way today and in the Regency period, I mean, Jesus empowered and equipped women to go out and speak and lead.
So, so this is very much a book with a message.
I tried really hard to make it a story, an engaging story with women who have problems and trauma. One, Mara, she's been abused. She's trying to overcome that trauma. She works very hard learning different ways of overcoming the trauma and the impacts of trauma and recovering and healing. And and the other woman is actually grappling with racism. So these are both themes that are relevant today. But it is a book with a message, but more importantly, it is a story. It is a fiction. It is a story about two women and their personal character development.
And that's good to hear. And of course, so many really good books, so many really good stories. Of course, they have a message, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is great. So how did you feel about writing a book which is set in a time and in a culture which is so different from your own? I mean, you're in Canada, so yeah, sort of 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, very different place.
It was difficult. I have not been to Israel or Palestine, however it may be called. And so, some people think you have to have experienced something to write about it. But then again, if you look at J.K. Rowling, she was able to write from a male perspective or a female perspective. And so I think in some cases, we can write from things that we haven't personally experienced. But it did take a lot of research, reading from others who have traveled there, been there, or written about the land. For me, it was a double type of research, because I was, for example, in the foods, I would research, what are the typical foods? Mara, my main character, loves to cook. What would she have been cooking? And so I would look at what foods are common and popular and available easily and cheaply in Israel. And I thought, okay, good. I've got my research. I'm going to go with for example, baklava. And then I learned that that's not available in the first century. And so I had to change her favorite fruit from baklava to apples, raisins, and cinnamon cakes. So, I mean, it's the time zone as well as the region that made the research time consuming. And then, of course, the added element was the interpretations of what Jesus might have said or done.
Yeah, and there's a lot there, isn't there? I mean, I can imagine probably present day Israel or Palestine, probably fast food's quite a big deal out there, and that certainly wouldn't have been a thing. Although they'd have had their own version of fast food. I mean, is that something you came up in your research? What was sort of common street food? I mean, I'm asking you a question here at a tangent, but just curious as you brought it up.
Yeah. I don't have street food in my novel, but I do have
Fair
Mara
enough.
cooking constantly. Every time you see her in the novel, she's chopping or cooking or baking or putting something off on the brazier. She's, you know, that is all her time, because I have visited Africa before, and I know that it takes like an entire day to go to market and to buy things at 3 different or 4 different stalls and to try to cook it over a fire. It takes the whole day to prepare a meal.
Absolutely, yeah. It's good that you've got that experience of going to Africa, because you've at least you've had the experience of going to a different culture and seeing how they do it and seeing how very different that is. In your approach, did you start writing and then think, actually, I need to know more about this and then research, or did you do all the research first and then settle down or write? Or talk us through that process. How did that work for you, Elaine?
So to start with, I was just very personally interested in exploring the women of the Bible. So because I had been a financial advisor, I wanted to know about Joanna, Susanna, and Mary Magdalene, because they are mentioned in Luke chapter 8 as being financial advisors and patrons for Jesus and the disciples. I do believe that they underwrote the whole Galilean ministry, and Jesus accepting them as financial supporters is a way of treating them as disciples, because that was the role of the disciple, was to be a financial supporter. So I started with the financial support, and where would women get money? I mean, if they're financially supporting Jesus out of their personal means, where did that money come from? Of course, that would be my natural question as a financial advisor. And so I did find that women were able to inherit, mostly just if they didn't have brothers. And they were also able to manage their own affairs in some situations. And they were also able to have their own business. If it was, for example, sewing, being a seamstress or a tailor. And so they did have ways of having money. And that was one. So I just started by exploring what I was interested in first. And then after I got all this information together, then I thought maybe others would be interested, and the best way to present it would be in a story.
What are the sources? I mean, for talking about the Regency period, obviously we can go back and we can read original diaries, we can read Jane Austen. Jane Austen's a source for the period, and lots of other novelists. There's a whole host of material that's available, but you go back 2,000 years, and what is available? Talk us through, what are the sources that you used, Elaine?
Mm-hmm. And there are a number of sources that talk about Israel in the first century. Most of those are Christian sources. And I found, I also wanted to include some Jewish and some Islam sources, just because they're equally old and they're not Holy Scripture, but I mean, for a Christian, but they are valid historical documents. So, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to be seeing these as original documents, but so I would go online and I would search up and I would see articles written from a variety of sources explaining their take on certain passages of the Bible. So I find that it's interesting to hear the different ways that a story can be perceived and understood. And I think that we as Christians have often looked at those stories from the normal dominant cultures, so to speak, the male perspective. So my whole idea of this novel is to look at things from the women's perspective. So it was just a lot of various articles. Some of them are interpretations, some of them are devotionals, some of them are just imaginings from other people, and then putting it together. There's a lot of different ways of looking at things. For example, the Catholic Church, the Protestant, they have different views on Mary, the mother of Jesus, whether she remained a virgin or whether she had children after Jesus. So there's both schools of thought out there. I looked at both schools of thought, and I just, in the end, had to pick one. And so when there's a lot of different conflicting historical information, you have to end up just going with the theory that you want to or believe is plausible, and then go with that for the novel.
The internet has made it so much easier, hasn't it, for anyone who wants to write a historical novel to get access to a wide range of materials in a way that wasn't possible even 20 or 30 years ago. So that's a real blessing to all of us who want to write in this area. And it sounds like you've taken full advantage of that.
That's it, yes.
Did you encounter anywhere any sort of document? Obviously, you've not seen the originals, and you maybe not even seen good translations of the originals, I don't know, but any sort of document that was written by a woman in the period?
Nobody knows who wrote the book of Hebrews in the New Testament. And for many years, it was thought to be written by Paul. Now scholars have decided that it was not written by Paul. And in the book of Hebrews, quite often it flips from what the writer did to what the writer and her partner did. And I do think it's possible that Priscilla wrote that letter to the Hebrews. Priscilla, who worked in partnership with her husband Aquila, is mentioned quite often as a leader in Corinth and in Ephesus and in Rome. And it is very possible that she wrote a letter to the Hebrews, but we don't know, of course. And I also did look at the Gnostic Gospel of Mary, which again was probably not written by Mary, but it sounds like it was written by followers who were in the church when Mary was a leader.
So what was your biggest research challenge, would you say? Looking at all this material and all these different issues you got, what would you think was your biggest research challenge?
Probably the trickiest is still, portraying Jesus in a fictional novel. That's a tricky thing. People don't want you to make a mistake with that. So that's an area that you don't want to make a mistake on. And so being careful what he's saying so that it doesn't, so that it is believable and plausible that Jesus might have said that. And so I think the tricky thing is to walk that line where you're trying to present a new perspective of women being empowered, and you're also trying to show the Jesus that Christians are familiar with.
Yeah, the Gospels, the Bible as a whole, of course, it's a holy book. It's important to us Christians, but at the same time, it is also a historical document. Yes,
and then I do believe that it's a very valid and a historic document that has hardly changed at all in the centuries. So it is a valid source on its own. But what I did was, if I was having trouble with what Jesus would say in a certain passage, I would look at a dozen different translations of that passage, and they're very, very different from each other. The English translations of the original language all seem to have had their own angle. When they were trying to translate, they would try to be accurate, but sometimes the focus is on word for word, sometimes the focus is on general meaning. In the time of King James, that King James version was translated with certain parameters that focused on the morality of England and the honoring of the king, so that it does come through, that doesn't come through in other versions. And there's other translations that promote men or add the word man when it's not actually in the Greek. Even the when the thing in Ephesians 5 about women being submissive, there's been additions in some English translations where the original just says, submit to one another as wives to husbands. It never says, women, you have to submit to men. It doesn't actually say that. And and there's other areas that were very tricky to understand, like in Matthew 19, Jesus talks about divorce. And some people use that to say that divorce is only possible in times of when the woman is unfaithful. But in fact, there are other passages of the Bible that do allow women to leave abusive situations or allow marriage to break up whenever there is a difference between the two, and they can't live together. And so I do think that we need to realize, and I have Jesus saying, no, the focus is for men to be accountable to their wives and to be faithful to their wives. It's not to say you can leave her when she's unfaithful. It's to say, treat your wife right and be faithful to the vows that you made. It's not limiting women and saying you can't ever get divorced.
So obviously it must be tricky working with, and I said a document, but of course the Bible isn't a document. It's many different documents that have been put together over time. And it must be tricky working with something which is both a historical set of historical documents, but at the same time is important to so many people for their faith. Because as you say, if you stray a bit too far from what people consider to be right, then you're going to get some response. Now, as I alluded to just now, I'll ask a question about mistakes in research. And this question I often put to authors is about what happens when, well, have you made a mistake, ever realized you've made a mistake post publication? And I think everybody I've spoken to has said yes so far. Typically it's things like they've put North American mammals into Regency England, which simply weren't there. They've got raccoons and chipmunks running around, which is fairly harmless really, but it grates on an English reader to see that sort of stuff. You're working in a slightly trickier area, aren't you? Because people can feel quite strongly about some of the words that you're putting into people's mouths. Have you had any comeback on that at all that you're happy to talk about, obviously?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a fairly new book. I probably will get people saying that they disagree with what it is, because the theme shows that Jesus empowered women to speak and lead. And if you don't agree with that, you're not going to agree with my novel. I do empower women to leave a divorce if they're in a situation where that's called for. And some Christians don't think that's right, but I believe that Jesus endorses divorce. And so there are other times where I believe that my novel shows that women were empowered and equipped to speak and to lead. And if you don't agree with that, you probably won't agree with the novel. But so far it's a new novel, so I've had actually quite a lot of support from people who agree with the themes of the book and are basically saying it's about time that the church realized that women and men being equal means equal opportunities.
So we've talked about research and we've talked about sources. I mean, how much, if any, has archaeology? I mean, I studied archaeology at university, so I've got an interest in this. How much, if any, did archaeology play into your research?
What we do know is from archaeology is a bit about the Romans and their building and their structures. The Roman roads, which happened to be at their best at the time after Jesus, when the apostles wanted to travel widely and spread the news. So that was coincidence, who knows? But that's when the Roman roads were very strong and effective in spreading God's word. And I also looked at the Roman soldiers, their impact on the Jewish temple, the Roman soldiers in Caesarea, and some of the towns and cities that have changed since then. So I'm not sure if I would call that archaeology, but I looked at the Tetrarch Herod of Antipas and how he was in. He moved from to Tiberias and created the town of Tiberias on the seafront on the Sea of Galilee and named it in honor of Tiberius Caesar. However, that city was built on top of a Hebrew graves, Hebrew cemetery. So apparently no Hebrews ever went to. If they were God-fearing type Hebrews, they did not go to Tiberias. So there's no record of Jesus ever going to Tiberias, which I thought was interesting because Herod of Antipas, of course, wanted to see Jesus and see those fancy miracles. I did learn quite a bit about the Roman Empire and also the Roman culture and norms. I talked earlier about divorce, and it was actually in the Roman culture that high-class women couldn't divorce because that was part of the alliances, but low-class women, apparently, if they didn't stay with their husband for 3 consecutive nights, they were considered divorced.
I mean, I brought up archaeology particularly because, just to be clear, my own knowledge of archaeology is limited to a degree that I did a long time ago and so watching some television programs. But I'm fascinated by the notion of what you can dig out the ground. And of course, a lot of archaeology is actually very much about domestic stuff. They're digging up rubbish pits, basically. And you talk about the food earlier on. So I'm guessing that some of the research you did around the things that they ate at the time, some of the original sources for that would be archaeology, where they've dug out rubbish pits and they found leftovers of cooking, and they've determined what people were eating at the time.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Pots and pans and bits is exactly what they found. And there's been actually, because it was so influential the first century, there's a lot written about what they ate and where they traveled.
So I was going to ask you about what was one of the most surprising things you discovered during your research, although the point you just made about Tiberius, that surprised me, so that was interesting. Was there anything else that jumped out at you as being I hadn't really expected that?
Well, I mean, I came at it believing that women were honorable, and one of the biggest, most well-known women in the Gospels is Mary Magdalene. And even as a child, I was told Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. And nowadays, a lot of people still feel that way, but it is not actually in the Bible. So when I looked at Mary Magdalene from the Bible's perspective, she is an honorable, devoted disciple. She's following and traveling with Jesus. She was healed of 7 demons, and she had the financial resources to support Jesus out of her personal means. So there's nothing there that says that she had a sinful life of any kind. She might have been a virgin her whole life. So this thing about her being married to Jesus or being a prostitute, I think these are stories made by people that wanted to discredit a devoted woman disciple. And so Mary Magdalene, I always thought she was from the town of Magdalene. And in the book, I do write her as being Mary from Magdala, because that is the traditional view, is that Mary is from Magdala. But nobody actually knows for sure if Magdala at the time is the same as Magdala today. And apparently Magdala also means the great or the towering one. So it could have actually been an honorific title. Mary, who is called the Magdala, could be meaning Mary from Magdala, or it could mean Mary, the one with towering faith.
Or Mary the Tall comes to mind.
It could have been Mary the Tall, Mary the Tall Tower, that tall Mary over there.
Yes, exactly. Well, there seems to be a lot of Marys at the time, so that might be a helpful way of distinguishing.
There were so many Marys at the time. So in my book, I changed the Marys to keep them all straight. Mary Magdalene, I call Marie, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, I call Maria, and Mary of Clopas, I call Mara. Right. And Mary, whose sister is Martha, I call Miriam, just to keep them a little bit straight.
Yeah, absolutely.
In history, Philip also has a sister named Miriam, and so there's a lot of Marys to keep straight.
I can imagine. So talking of names and just makes me think of dialogue, I mean, how do you handle dialogue? Because obviously, to what extent did you think, I want to try and replicate the way they would have spoken then? Obviously, you're presenting it in English, versus how would the dialogue work in a way that's most approachable to a modern reader? How did you think about that, and how did you handle that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we already talked about researching the history, the location, the times, the theology, but I also had to research how to write. This is my first historical fiction. And so I did take some online courses on writing, how to add tension, plot, character development, and also what kind of dialogue tags to use, or how to keep the dialogue moving, how to prevent a monologue, how to make sure the dialogue tag doesn't get in the way of the flow of conversation. But honestly, I chose from the beginning to use today's language. I didn't try to use ancient language. I wanted to make this whole story relevant to today. Just like the themes of abuse and racism and equality are relevant today, I wanted the dialogue to be in today's easy to read dialogue, easy to speak today's language.
So, I mean, how important to you is, or do you think research is, to historical novels generally? I mean, yeah. Generally,
it's very important. I've read a lot of historical fiction as well, Regency, as well as other time periods of old biblical fiction. And what I have found from talking to other readers as well as writers is that people sometimes don't keep it clear what's fiction and what's fact. So, I mean, I do have a lot of fact in there, but I also have some fiction in there. So I mean, for example, so in writing a historical fiction, I think the research is absolutely important, because some readers won't go to the extra step of figuring out what is actually factual. And if they take my fiction story and believe it's 100% fact, then it might get some information wrong. So they will need to go back to the scripture for the actual truth. In the end of a novel, I have a section for the two main characters, Mara and Joanna, saying, okay, here's what's biblically true, and here's what's traditionally known, and here's what's totally fiction for the novel. So at the end of the book, I do write that out clearly, because I don't want people to misconstrue my words to be 100% fact. This is not a theology textbook, so it is a combination of fact and fiction. All of the fiction that I wrote is consistent and fits in with the facts, and is plausible that it could have happened this way.
It's great. And I got a couple of reviews that I've made a note of about your work. And so this is reviewing Elaine's book, Forgotten Followers from Broken to Bold. This is part of the review. Through meticulous research, Elaine Kelly introduces us to a diverse cast of characters and adds historical detail that opens our eyes to often unknown wider contexts of the era. So meticulous research. I think another reviewer also referenced meticulous research. And I like this one. It was talking about another review. It was a bonus to read the epilogue, in which Kelly lays out the traditions around which her characters are built, and the facts, traditions, and fictions about Mara and Joanne, through whose eyes unfold the story, Forgotten Followers from Broken to Bold. So there's a couple of reviewers there really picking up on that research that you've done.
Yes, I did notice the reviews mentioned the research, and I guess the research that I did in the background is coming through in the stories and in the writing, which is fantastic. I do think the research in the Regency area or in the biblical area are both very important, because people may perceive that as being a fact, and it is in fact plausible. But I do think that putting it in a fiction story allows you to see more the meaning of the research. You can read research that says Jesus treated women as equals, but it doesn't hit you the same until you see Jesus washing a woman's feet and telling her, I want you to be one of my people. That's when you really know what treating women equally means.
Yeah, it's so much more powerful when you show it rather than telling it.
Yes, that's exactly it. Showing rather than telling.
You've added an epilogue to your book, a historical note, I guess. Is that another way of describing it, a historical note?
Yes, I think so. It's basically saying what could have happened to the 12. I have 12 women disciples in my novel, and it's what might have happened to them after the time of the resurrection.
Right. So it's not so much a historical note, because a historical note will typically say, and you've read quite a lot of historical novels, so I'm sure you've read a few which have got historical notes in the back.
Yeah.
Yeah, which explain which might say, give a bit more detail about specific things that are referenced in the novel, or they might actually say, this is where my novel deviates from history.
Yeah, so this one is not so much exploring the historical notes, because there were a lot of historical notes in the novel, but I haven't written that as a note at the back of the novel. The epilogue is more to do with the characters that I reference and what might have happened to them. So most of that has to come from the Catholic history, which was the universal church at the time in the 1st and 2nd century. And so they have stories, for example, one of them is a woman named Salome, the mother of James and John, the two disciples, James and John. And they left their fishing boat. Their father, Zebedee, he's left in the boat with the hired man. That's what the Bible says. We never hear from him again. So we don't know if he, likes that his two sons. I don't think he liked it that his two sons left him in the fishing boat and went off to follow this new cult leader who was rebelling against the leaders. So in my novel, I have Zebedee being very angry with his two sons for leaving the family business. and I have the family broken and divorced after that. But Salome, the mother of James and John, is specifically named in the Gospels as being present at the crucifixion. And in the Catholic Church history, Salome is revered as a saint. It says that she later traveled to Ephesus and that she is buried in Veroli, Italy. So that little bit of extra information shows her as being a single woman after the resurrection and traveling to Italy.
Yeah, and I do really get the point about Zebedee, because every time I read that story about the sun's going off, and I just think, really, he'd be happy about that, because obviously,
yeah, he would.
So
not,
important to
my
them.
father, he would not be happy that his sons left the family business. No.
Yeah. So I think I can guess the answer, but I'll ask the question anyway. So, how important do you think it is for a historical novelist to, or how much responsibility do you think they have to their reader to not mislead the reader about what life was actually like in the period they're representing?
I really like to know what women were up against. I mean, for example, in the 18th century, I read, researched about women preachers in that time period when I was looking at women in ministry. And they spoke against the policies in England where prostitutes were basically violated by police and accused of spreading the sexual diseases when they had no autonomy or agency. So I do think it's important for us today to know what restrictions women were under and men were under, because men were under certain restrictions as well. So what were they dealing with in their culture of the day? I think that's very, very important. As far as the Bible goes, I think the Bible it's seen as a very patriarchal book. It is written by men for the most part, for men. That's kind of the impression most people have. But if you dig a little bit deeper, I find that the writers maybe were under restrictions from the time where they couldn't explicitly say, hey, men, submit to your wives, because that wouldn't have gone down well. But they do say, submit to one another, husbands likewise.
I can see a fascinating theological discussion here, but this isn't about theology, so we'll part stuff like that. But it's great. It's great to hear your passion and the research that you've been doing, Elaine, and how that's translated into this book, which I'm sure will be so useful to so many people. So you talked about reading a variety of historical novels across a variety of periods. I'll put you on the spot. What's your favorite historical period to write in, or to read in, should I say? Let's say read, not write.
I guess what first got me started was the biblical fiction. And one of the first ones I read was a series by Elaine Smith, where she develops the characters of the wives of David. In particular, she talks about Michelle, who's, apparently she never has children. And at the time I was struggling with infertility. And I thought it was very interesting to hear this fiction novel about this woman who was the first wife of David and didn't have any children.
So biblical fiction rates highly in your reading by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So you've written, so the book that you've written, that's the first one, isn't it?
You know what? About a decade ago, I did write a book called Give Smart: How to Make the Most of Your Donation Dollar. I was, as you know, a financial advisor.
Right, yes.
So this was a fiction story with a message about how Canadians could give to charity and what the tax implications would be and the different methods of donations.
So for this part of your writing career, this is very much your first book.
I would call it my first book, yes, yeah. Because I have been devoted all of my time to it, basically, except for when I'm with my little grandson. I'm writing and researching and editing and promoting this book.
Any more? You're going to be writing any more books?
Yeah, so I do want to write a follow-up for set in the time of Paul. A lot of Paul's letters are the ones that give women trouble. Because the chapters that limit women are often written by Paul. So I'm going to write a book about Junia, who is an apostle that Paul credits as an outstanding apostle. And I'm going to have her traveling and preaching and leading and going to prison and being freed and helping the church in various parts, including Rome, which is where she is in the letter to the Romans chapter 16. That's the only time that Junia is mentioned in the Bible. And so you can look for the book about forgotten apostles From Broken to Bold, and that will feature Junia.
Um,
And also I'm working on a study guide. As you know, we're talking about writing and history and research today, but for people that want to look at the theological history or the notes behind the novel, there are quite a lot of sort of theological notes behind the novel. And so I have a study guide that'll be coming out soon. I'm just going to be getting it edited this month.
Excellent.
Or maybe it'll be out maybe January, late January.
So in a moment, I'll ask where people can find you online. But before then, what would your tip be or tips be to anybody who's out there watching this now and who's just getting into writing historical fiction or would like to write historical fiction? What would your words of wisdom be based on your own experience, Elaine?
Well, probably a good place to start is to read historical fiction, to read more of the genre that you want to write, so that you get an idea of the kind of writing and the kind of research and the kind of storylines that are already out there. And so reading the genre that you plan to write, and so that your book, your writing will fit into that genre, would probably be making it easier to market if you're in an existing genre and if you follow the rules of that genre.
Any tips on research?
I am naturally curious person, so I read an article and that makes me think of another question, and then I read several more articles and then I dig a little deeper. So I do enjoy the research quite a bit, but I think what happens with writers is they write it first and think it's done. Like a year earlier, I thought my book was done a year ago, and it went through like 8 more months of editing. And then I had other people look at it and they had different perspectives, a Jewish perspective, a survivor's perspective, a Christian perspective, a Catholic perspective. And then I reread it, and then I had to edit it again. And then I took more courses on the point of view and the voice to use and the characters and the how to add tension. And so I think it's not as easy as just writing. I think it is important for us also to focus on the skill of the craft itself, and making it easier to read, and adding a story that moves and characters that move.
That's great. It's great to hear you talking about the fact you had lots of people looking at it to give their own perspective, because they will inevitably ask questions and make comments that you hadn't thought about, and also various rounds of editing as well.
So it was edited numerous times over a number of months.
Yeah. And every time you do any of these things, you are making your book better. And there's a lot of books out there that, I mean, I've read quite a few recently, just sort of exploring various genres where you think a bit more of doing what you did would have made them so much better, I think.
Yeah. So if you imagine a sculpture or even a precious gemstone, it comes out as a rock from the stone, but it's not shiny until it's buffed and ground and broken up and polished some more. And so it does take quite a bit of, it takes as much time to edit as it does to write.
Absolutely. That's great. I love that metaphor. I love that image. Well, so it's been great talking to you, Elaine. Thank you. So remind us again about the book, the title, where we can find it, and where we can find you online.
Okay. Well, I just really want to thank you again, Andrew, for having me. I know that my book isn't in the Regency period, but I do think that people who read Regency novels are interested in women's role in society, and it picks up on that theme. So my website is elainekelly.ca. I am in Canada. And so I am Elaine Kelly, author, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
And the book is
Forgotten Followers, From Broken to Bold. So Forgotten Followers, that's just basically saying that the women who followed Jesus, who were disciples and apostles, have been forgotten by history. They haven't been included in the theological post-secondary master's programs. So these women are forgotten followers, and from broken to bold because they are broken by trauma and abuse, and Jesus does help them to become bold. And I believe that all of us, hopefully your listeners today, Andrew, can have the confidence, the healing that they need to become bold.
Absolutely. So that's Forgotten Followers, From Broken to Bold, and it's available on Amazon.
Yep, Amazon, Chapters Indigo in Canada, and Barnes and Noble. But Amazon UK is a great place to go.
Well, thank you again, Elaine. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. And I wish you all the best with the book and with the new book as well.
I just very much appreciate you speaking to me today. Thanks, Andrew.
It's been wonderful. Thank you very much.